Early one morning, on the 12th of July 1922, a policeman was walking down the canal towpath in Leeds when he spotted something out of the ordinary. Looking closer, to his horror, he realised there was a dead body in the water, which turned out to be a man with a severe wound to the back of the head, resulting in a fractured skull. He had nothing in his pockets, and oddly, was wearing no shoes, which seemed strange, as they were not found in the surrounding area after a search. His identity was unknown. After a number of inquiries, the victim's housekeeper, Louise Jackson, identified him as John Frobisher. There was, as it turned out, one suspect by the name of Louise Calvert, who is described as ill-mannered with a violent temper, but nothing could be proved. At the time, she worked as Frobisher's housekeeper at Mercy Street in Leeds. Suspicion had initially fallen on her, but the coroner's court returned a verdict of misadventure and ruled that the death was a simple drowning. So, nothing could be proved. The Yorkshire city of Leeds in the 1920s was shaped by its 19th century industrial might, based on wool, engineering and printing. Life was hard for much of the working class. There were long working hours, low wages and basic back-to-back terraces of brick houses, often overcrowded, with shared yards and outside toilets. Safety at work was basic, and accidents were common with the repetitive work. Women and men worked side by side, although men were paid more. There were long hours, low wages, basic food, and soot-stained streets. This was the world that Louise Calvert, who was sometimes known as Louis, was born into. We almost never know very little about the lives of criminals and their motivations, but prior to her death, she wrote a detailed account of her life in an exercise book, which maybe gives a glimpse into the decisions that she resorted to, and her inevitable downfall. But there again, she was known to be a chronic liar. The village that Calvert lived in as a child was small and modest. Main employers in the area were coal mines and wool mills. She and her sister Edith both worked at the wool mill. Edith got married, and suddenly Calvert found herself working harder to make up for the loss of income for the family. Calvert still worked at the mill, but worked much less, and lied about it to her family. This led to some conflict, because Calvert always found herself blamed for it. After that, she ran away from home around 1907, lost her job, and started work as a kitchen maid in an infirmary. This is a time in her life where everything started to go wrong for her. In 1911, aged 15, she was charged with her first criminal offence, the theft of £2.10 plus a gold ring. She was arrested again for theft the following year. This landed her a year in Borstal. She didn't do so well there, and at one point was put in a straitjacket for hitting an officer. She was released in 1913. You could be sent to one of these places, which were little more than asylums, for cursing, or even being a suffragette. Her mother tried to steer her back on track several times. In the end, nothing really worked. She was eventually disowned, and her family went so far as to cut her out of family pictures. After her release, Calvert had a track record of different thefts and petty offences over the years. She would end up giving birth to her son, named Kenneth, whilst in prison for several offences. She claimed that she had a husband named James Jackson, who was a soldier, but this is unclear to being actually true. John Frobisher, whose body had been discovered in the canal, was born in 1873 and was usually in poor health, to the extent he was excused from war duty in 1918. His wife, Elizabeth, died during the Spanish flu pandemic, and by the time Calvert met him in 1921, he was a lonely widower. He hired her as a housekeeper and took both her and her baby in, and it was said that he was generally good to both of them. No one was arrested in connection with Frobisher's death, but Calvert would confess to his murder years later in her autobiography, saying he had come home drunk one night and became violent towards her, so she pushed him down the stairs and pawned his boots. She was of slight build, so how she managed to transport the dead body to the canal is unknown. She went back to work at a mill after Frobisher's demise, but then it closed down. Completely out of work, she lived in a tidy room above a pub, and then things seemed to improve. Using the assumed name of Louise Jackson, she took a live-in job as housekeeper to Arthur Calvert, who was a night watchman living at 7 Railway Place in the Pottery Fields area of Leeds. The child that she already had also went to live with them, and she and Arthur had an affair. This was when deception crept in, as she claimed that she was pregnant. But she wasn't. When Arthur's mother visited, she insisted they get married. Calvert had lied to her new husband and somehow kept him in the dark, even though she showed no outward signs of pregnancy. He started asking questions like, I know this is awkward, but aren't you supposed to be, gaining weight? Her reply was to produce a letter from her sister Edith, inviting her to her home in Dewsbury to have the baby. There was, of course, no baby, and the pregnancy had been feigned purely to force Arthur into marriage. A baby had to be found, and fast. On the 8th of March 1926, when the time came to go to her sister's, she instead went to share lodgings at Amberley Road in Leeds with a 40-year-old eccentric widow, Lily Waterhouse, who had had a difficult life. The arrangement between the two women was that Calvert would act as a maid and housekeeper in return for her board and lodging. While with Waterhouse, Calvert on March the 16th saw an advertisement placed by unmarried 17-year-old Myra Ward for a child to be adopted. Calvert agreed to adopt the baby and was due to collect on the 31st of March. Presumably, she intended to take the infant home to Arthur and pass it off as her own. There was great stigma attached to women who had a baby out of wedlock in the 1920s. Whether there was a formal adoption process is doubtful, as the mother would probably have been only too pleased to have been rid of the infant. This was a time when there was a lot of unmarried mothers who were forced to give up their newborns to avoid tarnishing their reputations, so advertisements were often put in newspapers. Lily Waterhouse had been born into a poor family of 8 children in Leeds and spent a lot of her life trying to stay out of the workhouse. She couldn't do hard work due to having a back problem. In 1912, she had married, and her husband died in 1925. She was said to be a nice person and didn't have a combative personality, like Calvert, who, when she approached her asking for a place to live, 40-year-old Waterhouse thought it would be a good idea. She didn't have great accommodation, but she'd be getting both extra income and some company. Being an incredibly lonely person and having a new friend was precious to her. The domestic situation turned out to be not quite as hopeful because Calvert refused to work as agreed, and they argued constantly over this and other matters. It had been noticed that some personal items and silverware were going missing, and Waterhouse found pawn shop tickets from which she concluded that it was Calvert who was stealing the items, which led to a row between the two. Waterhouse was so scared by this point that she left the building, going to her friend William Byrne at his bookshop, telling him what was going on. She felt betrayed and afraid, particularly because Calvert had threatened to hurt her. Prior to the new housemate moving in, her landlord had been threatening eviction. She couldn't afford just kicking her lodger out, as extra money was coming in to help pay the rent. Waterhouse made the mistake of telling that she was going to the police. Her suspicions were reported on the 30th of March, and she was told to return the next day to lodge a formal complaint against her lodger. Sadly, when she got home, she made another mistake of telling Calvert what she had done. The police had arranged for Waterhouse to appear before magistrates on the 1st of April to apply for an injunction. On the 31st of March, Calvert was seen by her neighbours coming into the house around 6:15 p.m. About 7:30 p.m., her neighbours heard loud banging sounds coming from the house, and a few minutes later saw Calvert leaving. One of the neighbours, Mrs. Clayton, asked what the noise was all about. The reply that there was some furniture being moved around. Mrs. Clayton's reply was that she thought she heard Mrs. Waterhouse make some strange sounds. Yes, replied Calvert. I've left her in bed crying because I am moving out. As Waterhouse didn't show up in court on the morning of the 1st of April, 2 detectives were sent round to her home to find out why. After hearing about the commotion from her neighbours, which aroused their suspicions, they managed to get a key to open the front door. They found Waterhouse lying dead at the top of the stairs. She had been hit over the head and strangled. There were no signs of a struggle, as might have occurred in a break-in, but one of the officers noticed that she was barefooted. There were marks around her neck, consistent with strangulation, and marks on her wrists and legs. It appeared that the motive wasn't robbery, as the victim had a small amount of money on her. Because there were so few possessions in the household, it was hard to work out if anything was stolen. The police started to question the neighbours and were told of a housemate who lived there, who had moved out on the day the murder had been committed. No one really knew who the person was, apart from the fact she was called Louise. The person had apparently come back in the early morning, but carelessly left behind a letter with her name and address on it. The baby's grandmother had sent. There was only one obvious suspect. The day of the murder, Calvert had picked up Mara's baby, posing as a hospital worker. She arrived back home at Railway Place after stopping briefly at Arthur's sister's. She held the baby in her arms and proudly presented her to Arthur and her son. It was a happy occasion for the family, especially Arthur. And then the police knocked on the door. Calvert opened the door to them. The officers found she was wearing her housemate's boots, even though they were several sizes too large, and after a search, found some of the missing property. She was arrested and taken to the police station, and there charged with the murder. As detectives questioned her, a pack of lies unfolded. She insisted that the items of property had been given to her to pawn, and that Waterhouse was confused and had probably forgotten that she had given them to her. She went on to explain that the morning Waterhouse was murdered, a man named Fred Crabtree was a visitor that Waterhouse had been expecting. He was allegedly a soldier planning on moving to Canada, and Calvert said that the victim had been fine when she last saw her. Of course, she said this while in the police station, wearing Waterhouse's missing boots. The police did look into this unlikely story and found a piece of paper with the name Fred Crabtree in Calvert's bag with an address. He was traced to Barnsley and worked at the colliery. When they found him, he was in the hospital with a head injury. A roof had caved in on April the 2nd. He was able to account for his movements and described what he'd been doing on the night of March the 31st. He hadn't been in Leeds at all. What was more was he didn't know the victim or the accused. On Wednesday the 7th, Calvert came before Leeds city magistrates, charged with the murder, and was remanded in custody to stand trial at Leeds Assizes. Her case was heard on the 5th and 6th of May, and she was found guilty, even with her testimony that a man had been around. She was wearing the victim's boots, had coincidentally moved out the day of the murder, and Waterhouse had been afraid of Calvert. She was portrayed as someone who could not be trusted in any circumstances, who had come up with several different stories about the murder, but no one believed her. She accepted her death sentence calmly, but claimed that she was pregnant and could not, therefore, be hanged. The practice was that pregnant women were always reprieved at this time. She was taken to Strangeways Prison in Manchester to await execution. This is strange in itself, as there was Armley Prison in Leeds. The reason, perhaps, was that the condemned cell was already occupied. She was examined by a doctor, and it was thought it was just possible, although very unlikely, that she might be in the early stages of pregnancy, but that it would not cause a problem to execute her. It was not uncommon for condemned women to claim that they were pregnant in order to avoid the hangman. In those days, the law was that a condemned woman could not be deemed pregnant unless the pregnancy was over 140 days. For example, in 1848, Charlotte Harris, guilty of murdering her husband, actually was pregnant and was informed that she would be allowed to have the baby and then be hanged. On behalf of Calvert, a petition for a reprieve containing 2,000 or 3,000 signatures was submitted, but was rejected. The execution was put in the diary for the morning of the 24th of June. The Home Secretary informed her solicitor that there would be no reprieve and that the story of her pregnancy was not believed to be true. Whilst in the condemned cell, Calvert asked for an exercise book so that she could write her life history. One interesting bit of information in it was that she confessed to the murder of John Frobisher in 1922, when she had been employed as his housekeeper. The motive at the time seemed to be robbery. She was calm and collected for her execution, but never admitted to the murder of Waterhouse, always saying it was Crabtree. She was able to see her 6-year-old son Kenneth one last time. He was taken into care after the execution. As to the baby of Myra Ward, there is no record. It could be assumed that she was brought up by Arthur Calvert and his family, but there are no records going forward. At 9:01 on the morning of Thursday, June the 24th, a small group of men silently formed up outside the condemned cell at the end of B Wing in the central area of Manchester's Strangeways Prison. After a signal from the governor, Thomas Pierpoint, Britain's go-to hangman at the time, entered the cell at precisely 8 a.m., accompanied by 2 male warders. The 2 women warders who had been looking after the prisoner told her to stand up, and Pierpoint took her arms and quickly strapped her wrists behind her with a leather strap, before leading the way out of the cell through a second door, which had been uncovered by sliding away the wardrobe. The prisoner was led forward into the execution chamber and stopped by Pierpoint on a chalked T precisely over the divide of the trap doors. The two warders, standing on boards set across the trap door, supported her, one on either side, while Pierpoint's assistant put leather straps around her ankles and thighs. Pierpoint put a hood over the condemned's head, followed quickly with the leather-covered noose, positioning the eyelet just under the lower left jaw. After checking that all was in place and ready, he promptly pulled a lever to open the trap door. The hooded figure disappeared and dangled in the space below. It had taken no more than 20 seconds to carry out the sentence of the court. Her body was left on the rope for the customary hour before being taken down and prepared for autopsy, which found that her death had been instantaneous and confirmed that she was not pregnant. The body was buried in an unmarked grave within the prison grounds. The event drew a crowd outside the prison gates, estimated at some 500 people, many of them women, who waited around until the death notice was displayed on the prison gates. It has been said that the convict was somewhat disappointed to find the press were not going to be allowed to witness her hanging, a practice that had been discontinued some years earlier. She was the first woman to be executed at Strangeways Prison since 1886. As to the reason for the stolen footwear, the shoes were probably stolen as an afterthought.